I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The Mormon theocracy on the Mississippi was tossed into the throes of chaos by recent events. Governor Thomas Ford, attempting to enforce the law of the land, had been very clear in his letter to Joseph Smith and his personal communication with John Taylor, who relayed the message to the prophet. If Joe and Hyrum didn't agree to be arrested on the morning of June 23rd, he'd order out the militia to occupy Nauvoo until they could be found. The previous night, Joe, Hyrum's sidekick Abiff Smith, Whiteout Willard Richards, and good old pistol-packing Porter Rockwell committed to their fateful crossing of the Mississippi under the cover of night, where they planned on camping for a few days until horses and provisions could be prepared for their journey to the Great Salt Lake to build the new Zion away from all law enforcement. The Mormons would follow close behind and begin their mass migration to the northern corner of Mexico that following summer. By running away from the Mormons at this crucial juncture in Joe's life, he abandoned them when they needed him the most. Yeah, his life was in danger, but cowardice is most often revealed when the consequences are dire like this. Joe sent a message to each and every one of the 15 to 20,000 Mormons living in Nauvoo and Illinois at large that night that he valued his own life more than he valued theirs. No true leader worthy of adulation would abandon his people in the throes of a coming war like this. Further, without leadership, what would the Nauvoo Legion do when Ford's Illinois Militia attempted to enter the city and occupy it to find Joseph Smith? Would the Legion see this as aggression and answer with aggression, thus kicking off the war and setting Nauvoo under siege? Or would the Legion give themselves over to Governor Ford, who was the rightful commander-in-chief here, whose authority supersedes that of a simple mayor's, being Joseph Smith's, right? The posse of 30 men to arrest Joe and Hyrum entered the city of Nauvoo at 8 a.m. on June 23rd, expecting the fugitives to follow the orders of the governor of Illinois. The arrest couldn't be effected, and they would have to return to Carthage empty-handed, leaving one officer by the name of Yates in Nauvoo to watch for any fishy behavior and to keep an eye out for the fugitives. However, it wasn't quite that simple, which is what we're going to discuss today. Events on June 23rd transpired quickly, and it's easy to get lost in attempts to sequence these events. As always, I'll do my best, but it was a busy and it was a chaotic day in Nauvoo history. First off, by 9 a.m. on the 23rd, the posse had been in Nauvoo roughly an hour, talking with citizens, asking around to find Joe and his friends, and all of the posse members were keeping an eye on their collective backs in case of an immediate insurrection. They were hostiles in a foreign land, right? These men were enemies of the prophet, and the people believed the rhetoric that the men were there to kill the prophet, or at least to escort him to a place where he'd be vulnerable to assassinate him. It was clearly tense in the city. After conversing with the arresting posse for some time, John M. Bernheisel, who was one of the people who visited Governor Ford with John Taylor the previous day, he crossed the river with Reynolds Cahoon, another trusted advisor to the prophet, to go and visit Joe, Hyrum, and Whiteout Willard in hiding near Montrose, Iowa. They went there to, quote, make some explanations respecting Governor Ford's letter, end quote. What did they actually say to Joseph Smith? We can only speculate. However, I would wager a guess that Reynolds Cahoon and John Bernheisel told Joe that just because he ran away didn't mean the Illinois militia wouldn't enter and occupy the city until the fugitives were found. So these men conversed for quite some time while the arresting posse remained in Nauvoo for a few more hours. During that time, they spoke with Alpheus Cutler and Henry G. Sherwood about the situation. Quote, the officer in command exhorted Alpheus Cutler and Henry G. Sherwood to have Joseph and Hyrum come back, as the safety of Nauvoo depended on it. He pledged himself that their lives should be protected, end quote. Could Joe and Hyrum be protected? Was this man's pledge for protection enough to convince them to come out of hiding and cross back over the Mississippi? These 30 men in the arresting posse were hand-picked by Governor Ford to carry out this mission. They were likely the most trusted contingent of the militia force that was in Carthage. If Ford sensed any of them may take an opportunity to execute vigilante justice, they wouldn't have been there in the first place. Somehow, the men were convincing enough to the Mormon leadership in Nauvoo that Joe and Hyrum would be protected. Quote, Alpheus Cutler was satisfied with this pledge and said it could be depended on, as he was an old acquaintance of his, and agreed to use his influence to fetch them back. They went and informed Emma, who requested them to go to Joseph and Hyrum and say that unless they returned and went to Carthage, Nauvoo would be burnt up and the people massacred. End quote. She was right. Emma's refusal to go with the Phelps family to D.C. and to meet with President John Tyler and petition again for redress, that synergizes with this statement perfectly. There was the eventual danger of the Nauvoo charter being revoked and then her husband's life being in danger, but the immediate threat of the militia entering Nauvoo was far more pressing. Honey, look, I know you're worried about dying, but if you run away from us, we're all dead. So Emma had her priorities straight, right? And she was obviously weighing her options in this growing conflict. But it wasn't just Emma who was considering the larger implications of the state militia entering Nauvoo. Some of Joe's closest allies were similarly fearful, although for reasons beyond the human cost. Quote, about 11 a.m., the posse had mounted their animals to return to Carthage. Now, I would add here where they would communicate Joseph's insurrection to Governor Ford, and he would order out the militia. Of course, but history of the church continues. Quote, when Hyrum Kimball laid his hand on Reynolds Cahoon's shoulder and said, there must be something done in this matter immediately, or our property in the city will be of no value, whatever, and a number of men will be ruined if posse leaves, end quote. So sure, the Nauvoo citizens will probably be massacred, just like Emma said, but think what that's going to do to our property values, Cahoon. We got to get these guys to surrender. We're going to lose our butts on city real estate. It continues, quote, Kimball then called the officer aside and promised if he would wait until 2 p.m., they would go over the river and try to persuade Joseph and Hyrum to come back. Upon that promise, the posse dismounted and the animals were ordered back to the stable, end quote. So Hyrum Kimball, and this is not Heber the Creeper Kimball, this is Hyrum Kimball. Heber the Creeper Kimball was headed to Boston right now on a mission for Joseph Smith. Hyrum Kimball bought them another few hours to make a decision whether they're going to stay on the Iowa side of the Mississippi and flee to the Great Basin in the next few days, or they were going to cross back over the Mississippi into Nauvoo and give themselves up for arrest. So messengers were sent up the Mississippi to William Jordan's farm where Joe Hyrum and Whiteout Willard were hiding to convey the events of that morning and push them to surrender. And hey, if you surrender, everything's going to be okay. You're going to be safe. You're going to be protected. Quote, about 11 a.m., Emma sent over Lorenza D. Wasson and Hyrum Kimball to entreat of Joseph and Hyrum to come back to Nauvoo and give themselves up for trial and to inform them what the governor intended to do in case they did not deliver themselves up. William Mines Phelps says that about noon, he went to the house of Captain John Killian as proposed by Joseph the night before. In a short time afterwards, Jonathan Dunham came in and they went to the house of William Jordan, where Joseph, Hyrum, and Dr. Richards were. Directly afterwards, Reynolds Cahoon and Orrin Porter Rockwell came in, and Cahoon commenced interceding with Hyrum for them to come back to Nauvoo, and stuck to it until he persuaded them to do so, end quote. Now, there were other considerations beyond the person and the property value, which would be lost once the Illinois militia entered the city. Quote, about this time, Lyman O. Littlefield came from the printing office in great agitation and said to Cahoon, something must be done. We must get those men back or we shall all be destroyed. I must have some help immediately to pack away the printing press and fixtures, end quote. Yeah, so all of this excitement had begun by the destruction of a rival printing press in the city. Now members of the Mormon leadership were concerned about their own Nauvoo neighbor and Times and Seasons printing press meeting a similar fate as the Nauvoo Expositor. I don't know if this technically qualifies as irony, but it sure is sweet to the taste. So while in hiding, Joe, Hyrum, and Whiteout Willard Richards were taking all of these meetings from people telling them that they need to just come back to Nauvoo and surrender to arrest. Hyrum Kimball had bought them until 2 p.m. before the posse would return to Carthage, which, because information traveled at the speed of the horse, bought them at least another 12 hours before the Illinois militia would descend on the city. By 1 p.m. on the 23rd of June, it was do or die. Quote, at 1 p.m., Emma sent over Orrin Porter Rockwell, requesting him to entreat of Joseph to come back. Reynolds Cahoon accompanied him with a letter which Emma had written to the same effect, and she insisted that Cahoon should persuade Joseph to come back and give himself up. When they went over, they found Joseph, Hyrum, and Willard in the room by themselves, having flour and other provisions on the floor ready for packing, end quote. Flour. Yeah, right, of course. All these guys have been awake for nearly 32 hours by this point. Of course it was flour. Now, when Pistolpack and Porter arrived at William Jordan's farm with Reynolds Cahoon so they could persuade Joseph and Hyrum to come back, this is an iconic moment in Mormon history. It's also used as ammunition against Emma Hale Smith Bideman for over a century and a half to come. This is the moment when Joe and Hyrum had this monumental conversation with Porter Rockwell after they had crossed the Mississippi for Mexico, but decided to go like lambs to the slaughter. And here it is from the history of the church, quote, Reynolds Cahoon informed Joseph what the troops intended to do and urged upon him to give himself up, inasmuch as the governor had pledged his faith and the faith of the state to protect him while he underwent a legal and fair trial. Reynolds Cahoon and Lorenzo Wasson and Hyrum Kimball accused Joseph of cowardice for wishing to leave the people, adding that their property would be destroyed and they left without house or home. Like the fable when the wolf came, the shepherd ran from the flock and left the sheep to be devoured. To which Joseph replied, If my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself. Joseph said to Rockwell, What shall I do? Porter replied, You are the oldest and ought to know best, and as you make your bed, I will lay with you. That's cute. Joseph then turned to Hyrum, who was talking with Cahoon, and said, Brother Hyrum, you are the oldest. What shall we do? Hyrum said, Let us go back and give ourselves up and see the thing out. After studying a few moments, Joseph said, If you go back, I will go with you, but we shall be butchered. Hyrum said, No, let us go back and put our trust in God, and we shall not be harmed. The Lord is in it. If we live or have to die, we will be reconciled to our fate. After a short pause, Joseph told Cahoon to request Captain Daniel C. Davis to have his boat ready by 5:30 to cross them over the river. End quote. Emma pushed Joe to come back with that letter. And I can't find the actual letter, but the content of what Port told Joe has kind of served as what Emma communicated through Porter Rockwell to Joseph Smith. When the shepherd ran from the flock, he left the sheep to be devoured. This conversation between Porter Rockwell and Joseph Smith lives in infamy in believing Mormon circles, because if Joe just didn't listen to Emma, he never would have crossed back over the Mississippi, he never would have been interred in Carthage, and therefore never would have been assassinated. American history would look significantly different if he didn't listen to Porter Rockwell. But Joe listened to what Emma said through Porter Rockwell, asked his older brother, Hyrum sidekick Abiff Smith, what to do, and they all agreed to give themselves up and see this thing out. Joe told Hyrum they'd be butchered, but Hyrum apparently believed in Joe's God more than Joe did, because he said, We'll be all right. The Lord is in it. We will be reconciled to our fate. Indeed, they were reconciled to their fate. They were now on a path to suffer the consequences of their own actions. There was a problem, though. Hyrum Kimball got that arresting posse of 30 men to stick around until 2 p.m. in Nauvoo before they returned to Carthage empty-handed, and Governor Ford responded by ordering out the militia to go and occupy Nauvoo. This conversation transpired over that deadline, meaning that Joe and Hyrum Whiteout Willard Richards, they wouldn't be back in Nauvoo until the posse was already nearly back at Carthage. They missed the deadline, and immediate action was required to keep Governor Ford from marching 1,000 soldiers into Nauvoo that night or the following morning. So Joe drafted a letter to Thomas Ford and sent it via express messengers Theodore Turley and Jedediah M. Grant. Jedediah M. Grant would be known as Brigham's sledgehammer in Utah. Here's the letter Joe sent. Quote, His Excellency Thomas Ford, Sir, I wrote you a long communication at 12 last night expressive of my views of your Excellency's communication of yesterday. I thought your letter rather severe, but one of my friends has just come to me with an explanation from the captain of your posse, which softened the subject matter of your communication and gives us a greater assurance of protection, and that your excellency has succeeded in bringing in subjection the spirits which surround your excellency to some extent. All those anti-Mormons are talking to you so much. Oh, it's a good thing that you brought them under control. And I declare again, the only objection I ever had or ever made to a trial by my country at any time was what I have made in my last letter, on account of assassins and the reason I have to fear deathly consequences from their hands. But from the explanation I now offer to come to you at Carthage on the morrow, as early as shall be convenient for your posse to escort us into headquarters, provided we can have a fair trial, not be abused, nor have my witnesses abused, and have all things done in due form of law, without partiality. And you may depend on my honor without the show of a great armed force to produce excitement in the minds of the timid. We will meet your posse if this letter is satisfactory. If not, inform me, at or near the mound at or about 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, which will be as soon as we can get our witnesses and prepare for trial. We shall expect to take our witnesses with us and not have to wait a subpoena, or apart at least, so as not to detain the proceedings, although we may want time for counsel. We remain most respectfully your excellency's humble servants. Signed, Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith. End quote. And so began the cover-up. Look, Joe and Hyrum ran from the law. They were convinced to surrender and go to court and see this out. Now they needed to contrive the necessary excuses to the powers that be, Governor Ford, to keep from the militia marching into Nauvoo because of the missed deadline that they ran away from. Now, it was all a misunderstanding from Ford's previous letter, right? No need to bring in the militia. We'll meet you tomorrow afternoon on the mound. The excuse given that Joe feared for his life, that's a legitimate excuse, right? He was in danger of assassination, but that doesn't necessarily excuse ignoring an arrest warrant, especially when his life was in danger for the very things he was supposed to be arrested for. However, Joe was smart enough to realize that with everybody telling him to just surrender, and with the assurance from Henry G. Sherwood that the arresting posse would effectively defend him from an assassination, he made a judgment call. See this out and then escape from jail or be released, whichever was most prudent, and then organize the next Mormon exodus to the Great Basin, right? Trying to make the journey west with so much pressure on Nauvoo was ill-advised, and it was poorly timed right now. But if the Mormons could have a few months to prepare while Joe and Hyrum were tied up in the court system, the next exodus could be executed less hastily and more effectively, likely retaining a larger percentage of the Mormons during the move to the Great Basin. It is notable, however, that Joe seemed to be acting completely defeated when he agreed to surrender. In the city council meeting before he decided to run, he acted defeated before he came up with a plan to flee west, but this new sense of defeat was quite different. Quote, about 4 o'clock p.m., Joseph, Hyrum, the doctor, that's Whiteout Willard Richards, and others started back. While walking towards the river, Joseph fell behind with O.P. Rockwell. The others shouted to him to come on. Joseph replied, "It is of no use to hurry, for we are going back to be slaughtered," and continually expressed himself that he would like to get the people once more together and talk to them tonight. Rockwell said that if that was his wish, he would get the people together and he could talk to them by starlight. End quote. Joe was going to surrender, and he wanted one final address to the Mormons, as he probably felt like his previous message about going to the West and raising a more righteous people might not sit well as his final sermon before all of these legal troubles. But there was a problem. Yates, the guy the arresting posse left behind, he was still in Nauvoo, and he was waiting to arrest Joe and Hyrum as soon as they publicly showed their faces. Besides, Yates and the arresting posse, they were still operating under the assumption that Joe and Hyrum had fled and that they were about to bring the militia into Nauvoo the following day. By the time Joe and his cabal of acolytes were, crossing back over the Mississippi and entering the city, the arresting posse would be riding into Carthage to inform Governor Ford of Joe's insurrection by refusing to surrender. Governor Ford would resolve to call out the militia, and If they entered the city the next morning and learned that Joe had just preached a sermon the previous evening, that would be an act of insurrection so blatant that it would just further inflame the anti-Mormons among the militia to the point that violence probably couldn't be prevented. But you do have to admire Pistol Pack and Porter's resolve to follow the prophet and, childhood friend, right? If you want to preach, I'll get everybody together and you can talk to them by starlight. Porter Rockwell was a murderer, but at least he was a loyal murderer, a murderer you can trust. But preaching by starlight was a bad idea, right? It would leave the prophet vulnerable to anybody in the city who wanted to either arrest or kill him on the spot. When Joe arrived in Nauvoo that evening after crossing back over the Mississippi, he understood the gravity of the situation by spending time with the few people on earth that he actually did care about. Quote, "It was the strong persuasions of Reynolds Cahoon, Lorenzo D. Wasson, and Hyrum Kimball, who were carrying out Emma's instructions, that induced Joseph and Hyrum to start back to Nauvoo. They recrossed the river at 5:30. When they arrived at his mansion in Nauvoo, Joseph's family surrounded him, and he tarried there all night, giving up the idea of preaching to the saints by starlight." End quote. The sun was going down, and shadows were casting further across the city of Nauvoo. The arresting posse were certainly back in Carthage by this point, and it was hoped that Theodore Turley and Jedediah Grant would arrive in Carthage to deliver Joe's surrender letter to Governor Ford before nightfall, thereby abating the mustering of the militia to march on Nauvoo that night. They'd also be able to observe what was going on in Carthage and then report it to Joseph the following day upon their return. So awake for over 36 hours by this point, Joe settled into the Nauvoo mansion surrounded by his family and many of his wives, where he crashed and he allowed the next day's events to hit him like a freight train upon waking. But while he slept, Turley and Grant made it to Carthage with Joe's letter of surrender as the stars began to peek through the firmament. Quote, "Colonel Turley and Elder Jedediah M. Grant carried it to Carthage, where they arrived about 9 p.m. They gave the letter to Governor Ford, who first agreed to send a posse to escort General Smith in safety to Carthage." End quote. There was a problem, however. Governor Ford had a few little demons on his shoulders who voiced dissent for the escort of the General Joseph Smith to Carthage. Quote, "Immediately afterwards, Mr. Skinner came in and made a very bitter speech to the governor, in which Wilson Law and Joseph H. Jackson joined, telling him naught but lies, which caused Elder Grant to ask if messengers to him were to be insulted in that manner. The governor treated them coldly and rescinded his previous promise and refused to send or allow an escort to go with Joseph, as he said it was an honor not given to any other citizen." End quote. That's a really interesting point. Now, we need to keep in mind that Joe was trying the patience of Governor Ford here. The previous letter that Ford sent to Joe, which Joe replied by saying, "We've done nothing wrong," stated that Joe was to surrender that morning of the 23rd, and that if any witnesses were required, Governor Ford would subpoena them accordingly, that just Joseph and Hyrum were to surrender to an arrest. Also, no escort, as that will only cause the Carthaginians to lose their mind. Now, 13 hours after the deadline for surrender, and Governor Ford's hand was called. To remain true to his first letter to Joseph Smith, he was required to call out the militia to invade Nauvoo and effect the arrests. Now, in this letter from Joe, he was surrendering on his own terms, claiming that he was bringing his witnesses anyway in defiance of Ford's previous letter. And then Joe wanted his own escort, but assured Governor Ford that they would escort him, quote, "without the show of a great armed force to produce the excitement in the minds of the timid," end quote. Ford had absolutely no reason to honor Joe's requests in this letter, as they were in stark contradiction to his own terms that he had laid out in his previous letter to Joseph Smith. He was the governor, and Joseph Smith was just an inferior military officer and a mayor of a city. Governor Ford called the shots here, and it was very gracious of him to even allow the messengers to deliver the letter without detaining them as leverage to ensure the prophet's surrender. Ford had absolutely no obligation to conform his conduct to the wishes of Joseph Smith. Joe had worn out his welcome long before Ford even arrived in Carthage 2 days prior. But Ford also had another point here. If Joseph Smith were any other citizen, let alone any other officer in any state-sanctioned militia, Joe would never be granted any of his wishes. Ford had absolute grounds to hold a court-martial of Joseph Smith in absentia and rule him guilty of treason, after which Governor Ford had legal grounds to march to Nauvoo with the Carthage militia and execute both Joseph and Hyrum in broad daylight. He had legal grounds to conduct the proceedings this way, and the fact that he didn't proves that he wasn't the rabid anti-Mormon like Colonel Levi Williams and others who just wanted the prophet dead. Governor Ford was doing everything in his power to keep this from spiraling out of control, which includes ignoring the requirements of martial conduct for officers who commit acts of treason, like Joseph and Hyrum had. With Governor Ford's patience wearing thin, he concluded this meeting with Joe's boys, Turley and Grant, by telling them to get out of here, tell your commanding officer that he better be in Carthage not by 2 o'clock, but by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, or I'll call out the militia as I promised that I would do 13 hours ago if Joe didn't surrender. So he sent them packing with this final dire message to carry back to the prophet. Quote, Ford would not allow the messengers to stay in Carthage through the night, but ordered them to start at 10 o'clock and return to Nauvoo with orders for General Smith to be in Carthage by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning without an escort. And he threatened that if General Smith did not give himself up at that time, that Nauvoo would be destroyed and all the men, women, and children that were in it. Messrs. Grant and Turley immediately started, but on account of their horses being wearied, they did not arrive in Nauvoo until about 4 a.m. of the 24th, when they went to General Smith to report to him the state of excitement in Carthage. He would not hear one word of the warning, as he was determined to go to Carthage and give himself up to the governor. End quote. So Theodore Turley and Jedediah Grant arrived in Nauvoo as daylight was near breaking on June 24th to deliver the message of immediacy to Joe, who probably slept like a rock that night after having not slept the previous night. So they woke him up on their arrival and notified him that his previous letter to Governor Ford stated that, he'd be at the mound near 2 p.m. That wasn't good enough. And Governor Ford demanded that Joe be in Carthage by 10 a.m. Joe sent a few letters demanding Horace Huggins and Joseph R. Wakefield to meet him in Carthage the next day at noon to provide legal counsel. And then he signed each of those 2 letters with, quote, "Do not fail me and oblige your old friend," end quote. So Joe got his posse together of all of the men who were charged with the original expositor destruction and riot. Quote, Monday, June 24th. Francis M. Higbee, having sworn out a writ before Judge Thomas Morrison, a justice of the peace at Carthage, on the 11th instant, that was 13 days prior, against Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, Samuel Bennett, John Taylor, William Wines Phelps, John P. Green, Stephen C. Perry, Dimmick B. Huntington, Jonathan Dunham, Stephen Markham, William W. Edwards, Jonathan Holmes, Jesse P. Harmon, John Little, Joseph Coolidge, David Harvey Redfield, Orrin P. Rockwell, and Levi Richards for riot in destroying the Nauvoo Expositor Press, the property of William and Wilson Law and others on the 10th instance. And Governor Ford having sent word by the posse that those 18 persons should be protected by the militia of the state, they, upon the assurance of that pledge at 6:30 a.m., started for Carthage. Willard Richards, Dan Jones, Henry G. Sherwood, Alfred Randall, James Davis, Cyrus H. Wheelock, A.C. Hoge, and several other brethren, together with James W. Woods as counsel, accompanying them. End quote. And really, one of the main reasons that I read all 18 of those names, in addition to the people who were accompanying him as the armed posse, that's Willard Richards, Dan Jones, Henry Sherwood, Alfred Randall, James Davis, Cyrus Wheelock, and A.C. Hoge, and several other brethren, maybe some of those people are your ancestors. Unfortunately, one of my ancestors isn't named in there. Unfortunately, it would be really fun if that were the case, but maybe some of you listening, your ancestors are listed there. This is the fateful posse headed into Carthage. Now, this wasn't technically an armed guard or a posse to protect the prophet, right? These were the 18 fugitives named in the original arrest warrant that Joe had refused to honor when Constable Bettisworth entered Nauvoo to place him under arrest, which led to the 2 sham trials in the Nauvoo Municipal Court and led to Governor Ford having to come out and handle these matters personally. Now, the others, the Whiteout Willard Richards, Henry Shearer, all those guys, Those were the bodyguards of the prophet, joining him on the journey to Carthage in outright defiance of Governor Ford's orders. Each of them were likely armed as well, right? That would only exacerbate the excitement of the Carthaginians upon their arrival. So they began the journey to Nauvoo, but not before Joe could take a few wistful moments of reflection when he caught sight of the temple. Quote, Joseph paused when he got to the temple and looked with admiration first on that and then on the city and remarked, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens. Little do they know the trials that await them." As he passed out of the city, he called on Daniel H. Wells, Esquire, who was unwell, and on parting, he said, "Squire Wells, I wish you to cherish my memory and not think me the worst man in the world either." End quote. That's a rather revealing passage. Daniel Wells, he was the justice who presided over those two sham trials in the Nauvoo Municipal Court that brought Governor Ford out to Carthage in the first place. What conversation transpired between Joe and Daniel Wells previously, which would cause Joe to say that to him? Now, Joe and Daniel Wells, they had a really interesting relationship, which is also quite notable because Wells wasn't a member of the church at this time. It wouldn't be until after the Battle of Nauvoo, during which Daniel Wells served as a lieutenant and defended the city, and he harbored refugees. It was after that he was baptized, after which he went with the Mormons out to Utah, served as a mayor of Salt Lake City, an attorney general of the state of Deseret. He dedicated the St. George Temple, and he was a loyal dog to Bloody Brigham Young during the construction of the Mormon Empire in the Utah Territory. I suppose I'm merely surprised that Joe considered Wells' opinion of him so highly that he would give those parting words to Wells before heading to his certain death at Carthage. "I wish you to cherish my memory and not think me the worst man in the world either." Very interesting. So after Joe saw the temple and he wistfully commented about it and the Mormons, and then he talked to Daniel Wells, the men set off, possibly as many as 50 of them leaving Nauvoo, probably with most of these men armed. Quote, "At 10 minutes to 10 a.m., they arrived at Albert G. Fellows' farm, 4 miles west of Carthage, where they met Captain Dunn, with a company of about 60 mounted militia, on seeing which Joseph said, 'Do not be alarmed, brethren, for they cannot do more to you than the enemies of truth did to the ancient saints. They can only kill the body.'" A little tongue-in-cheek there. The company made a halt when Joseph, Hyrum, and several others went into Fellows' house with Captain Dunn, who presented an order from Governor Ford for all the state arms in possession of the Nauvoo Legion, which Joseph immediately countersigned. End quote. All right, what does that mean? This is a really, really good move by Governor Ford here. The Nauvoo Legion was a significant threat in all of this. If he could neuter them by taking away at least some portion of their guns, that threat is reduced, right? The people still have their own personal guns, right? Nothing could force them to give them up because, of course, they wouldn't give up their guns, but the arms owned by the state, those could be revoked at any time. So the order came from Captain Dunn, no friend of the Mormons, and Joe countersigned it. So now Captain Dunn was to take that signed order from Governor Ford, signed by Joseph Smith, into Nauvoo, and all 3,500 Nauvoo legionnaires would be forced to surrender their arms to state custody. Only the state-owned arms, though, only ones that had been issued via John C. Bennett as a quartermaster general, right? But with the tension so high, an Illinois militia officer entering the city and demanding unilateral disarmament of the Nauvoo Legion, that would only excite the tensions even more. Even if this Captain Dunn carried the order signed by Governor Ford and Joseph Smith personally, would the people trust that he was acting under proper authority, or would they think that the signature of Joseph Smith was actually a forgery and that Captain Dunn was just disarming them to make an attack of the city more favorable for his Illinois militia troops? Plus, Joe had agreed to Governor Ford's directive to be arrested at 10 a.m., just a few miles from where this meeting is taking place with Captain Dunn of the Illinois Militia. If the Mormons perceived that Captain Dunn's disarmament order as an act of aggression, and they responded likewise with aggression, Nauvoo would be missing its commander-in-chief, Joseph Smith, in the very moment that the Illinois Mormon War kicked into action. This was a conundrum. Here is the resolution. Quote, Henry G. Sherwood went up to Joseph Smith and said, "Brother Joseph, shall I return to Nauvoo and regulate about getting the arms and get the receipts for them?" Joseph inquired if he was under arrest or expected to be arrested, end quote. Let me go ahead and answer that for you, Joe. Yes, you are being detained, and you agreed with the governor of the state to be arrested at this exact moment when this meeting is happening. You are very much expected to be arrested by Governor Ford, and he was showing a great deal of leniency in not calling out the militia immediately upon your first refusal to be arrested when you fled across the Mississippi. But instead, Joe asked one of his trusted sycophants for that answer. Henry G. Sherwood, quote, Sherwood answered, "No," when Joseph Smith directed him to return ahead of the company, gather the arms, and do as well as he could in all things, end quote. So, Joseph asked one of his sycophants if he's under arrest, and the sycophant said, "No, of course you're not." And then Joe said, "Why don't you go ahead of us and gather up the guns and do as well as you can in all things?" So Joe directed Sherwood to carry out this order given to him by Captain Dunn of the Illinois Militia on order of Governor Ford with a counter-signatory of Joseph Smith himself. But it's interesting here because Joe was so defeated, right? Opposing this order would be yet one more act of aggression that would result in the state militia entering Nauvoo. Everything was on a knife edge here. His hands were tied, and all he could do was acquiesce to this request. But Joe did take the opportunity to grandstand a bit in another iconic quote in Mormon history. Quote, Joseph then said to the company who were with him, "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward all men. If they take my life, I shall die an innocent man, and my blood shall cry from the ground for vengeance. And it shall yet be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." End quote. Yeah, Joseph could see himself as innocent if he was a narcissistic sociopath, which I think there's plenty of evidence for that. He was not innocent of the crimes against the state and the American Constitution. However, his blood did cry from the ground for vengeance, and he was indeed murdered, or assassinated if you prefer. But it was clearly the result of hot blood, not cold-blooded murder. Hot blood that he'd personally boiled for half a decade by this point. But then an interesting turn happens in this back and forth with Henry G. Sherwood, Joe, and the Illinois militia officer, Captain Dunn. Quote, Joseph then said to Father Sherwood, "Go, and God bless you." Sherwood then rode as swiftly as he could to Nauvoo. Esquire Woods left the company there and continued his journey to Carthage. So we have Sherwood going with the order from Joe and the governor to collect the Legion's arms, and then we have Joe's legal counsel, Esquire Woods, headed towards Carthage the other direction ahead of the company. But what about Joe and the arrested posse? They made an interesting decision after a little bit of commentary on the perceived intention of the disarmament order. Quote, this order for the delivery of the state arms was evidently designed to drive the citizens of Nauvoo to desperation, so that in the heat of their indignation they might commit some overt act which the governor could construe into treason, and thus have a shadow of excuse for his mob militia to destroy the Mormons. Now here's what they did. Captain Dunn requested the company to return to Nauvoo to assist in collecting the arms, and pledged his word as a military man that Joseph and his friends should be protected, even if it were at the expense of his own life. And his men responded to the pledge by 3 cheers. Captain Dunn no doubt feared that the order of the governor would excite the inhabitants of Nauvoo beyond endurance, and therefore chose to depend upon the well-known integrity of General Smith than to risk the chances of exciting the wounded feelings of a much-abused people. End quote. So, what does that mean? Well, Joe was already 30 hours overdue for the first arrest order, right? Which was served by the governor because his defiance to the first arrest warrant that was issued 13 days prior. He was 13 days plus 30 hours overdue for these arrest warrants. But the ultimatum, if he didn't surrender, was that the state militia was going to burn Nauvoo to the ground, and that he was now finally only an hour late for the final notice that Governor Ford gave him while Joe was trying Governor Ford's patience. And here, at this time, with tensions rising even more, Joseph resolved to return to Nauvoo again. instead of continuing on to Carthage, where he was expected at 10 a.m. This decision was made around 10:30 to 11 a.m. He was way overdue here. How long could Governor Ford be expected to extend more leniency when Governor Ford himself was surrounded by over 1,000 people who wanted nothing more than to march into Nauvoo with rifles over their shoulders? Joe going with Captain Dunn back to Nauvoo to execute this disarmament order was absolutely unnecessary, and it only ran out an already extinguished clock by more hours. Joe and the Mormons were on borrowed time, and Joe decided to mortgage even more time that he didn't have to assist Captain Dunn here. I can't stress this enough. This action was not necessary. Joseph did not need to go back to Nauvoo to disarm the Nauvoo Legion. He could have gone straight into Carthage. Jonathan Dunham was the acting Major General of the Nauvoo Legion. If he walked into Nauvoo with a signed order from Governor Ford and Joseph Smith telling the Legion to give up their arms, they would comply, or they would be in defiance to their own two commanders-in-chief, at which point the state militia would be forced to put Nauvoo under siege until the Legion, as a rogue military force, surrendered. Most importantly, Joe going back to Nauvoo on the 24th was terrible optics, right? Governor Ford and the 1,000 Carthage militiamen were expecting Joseph Smith on the outskirts of the city by 10 a.m., and he was still 4 miles out and already late. It would take another hour or two for intelligence to reach Carthage that Joe had turned back with Captain Dunn, at which point the riled up militiamen in Carthage wouldn't see Joseph Smith and his arresting posse riding into town, but just a single messenger. What does that look like? These people would lose their minds at yet another overt act of insurrection in defiance of the arrest orders, and the cries to Governor Ford to call out the militia into Nauvoo would reach a fever pitch. In some ways, Joe was testing Governor Ford and how serious Ford was about calling the militia out to Nauvoo here. Joe may have been completely defeated, but that didn't mean that he still didn't have some leverage. Until he was in cuffs behind bars, Joe's bargaining chip was himself, and he was able to make a display of that fact by turning back to Nauvoo instead of walking into Carthage, where he was expected. Joe didn't, however, just leave Governor Ford high and dry in this. Joe sent his legal counsel, Esquire Woods, into Carthage with this letter for Governor Ford. Quote, "Dear Sir, on my way to Carthage to answer your request this morning, I here met Captain Dunn, who has here made known to me your order to surrender the state arms in possession of the Nauvoo Legion, which command I shall comply with, and that the same may be done properly without trouble to the state. I shall return with Captain Dunn to Nauvoo, see that the arms are put into his possession, and shall then return to headquarters in his company, when I shall most cheerfully submit to any requisition of the governor of the state. With all due respect to your excellency, I remain your obedient servant, signed Joseph Smith." Joe also sent acting Major General of the Nauvoo Legion, Jonathan Dunham, ahead of himself with an extra order beyond the order from Governor Ford in his hand. Quote, "To Major General Jonathan Dunham and all commissioned and non-commissioned officers and privates of the Nauvoo Legion, you are hereby commanded to comply strictly and without delay within the order of the Commander-in-Chief, Governor Ford. Signed, Joseph Smith, Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion." End quote. Now, notably, Jonathan Dunham was also one of the 18 offenders who were arrested on the original charges of riot, right? He was just as guilty as Joe and Hyrum in this posse of arrested guys at this very moment, but this order from Joe apparently superseded the arrest order from Governor Ford? I don't know. Like I said, I can't see this as anything other than Joe just running out the clock and trying Governor Ford's patience. And what this all amounted to was chaos, right? For a few short hours, nobody knew what was going on. The militia and Governor Ford expected Joe again defy the arrest warrant. The citizens of Nauvoo expected Joe to be martyred in cold blood when he left the city at 6:30 that morning and a siege of the city to immediately follow. All of those plans and expectations were out the window because Joe does what Joe wants to do. Joseph and his company then returned with Captain Dunham, and they arrived in Nauvoo at about 2:30 p.m. That's what it says, so 2:30 p.m. Now, when the fact of the order of the state arms was known in Nauvoo, many of the brethren looked upon this order as another preparation for a Missouri-type massacre, right? Nevertheless, as Joseph requested that it should be complied with, they very unwillingly gave up the arms. So all of the state arms were gathered. They were interred in the Masonic Hall, begrudgingly, by members of the Nauvoo Legion. And this is a super important detail. These were the state arms that were originally supplied to the Nauvoo Legion because John C. Reckitt Bennett was Quartermaster General of the state of Illinois before he was named Major General of the Nauvoo Legion when he joined the Mormons, and the Nauvoo Legion itself was formed. They retained those arms, and many of those arms were holdovers from the Revolutionary War, and many of them were in disrepair until this order was complied with, right? However, there were still everybody's personal guns that couldn't be legally seized because America in the Second Amendment is bonkers, right? While the citizens were officially disarmed, the remaining Nauvoo Legionnaires were far from defenseless, and arguably the guns that were in their private possession, although less in number, were more modern and likely better maintained and more reliable in a battle than the arms that were issued to them from John C. Bennett at the formation of the Nauvoo Legion. So while these arms were given up, it was crazy to assume that the Nauvoo Legion didn't still massively overpower and outgun any militia that Thomas Ford could muster. Governor Ford knew this. Joseph Smith knew this. The anti-Mormons in the Illinois Militia knew that they were outgunned. The Legion was still incredibly dangerous, even though they were officially disarmed, and they were a massive threat, even if the militia was just using this disarmament as a pretense to make a more effective attack on the city. So while this was going on in Nauvoo, Hyrum sent one member of the posse with Joe's legal counsel, Esquire Woods, into Carthage to see what was going on. Quote, Hyrum said to Abram C. Hoge, "You go into Carthage and see what's going on and hear what is said on the matter." When Hoge arrived at Carthage, he met with Reverend Mr. Dodge, who had some time previously been very kindly treated by Hyrum. He warned Hoge that as sure as Joseph and Hyrum came to Carthage, they would be killed. Hoge also saw Hamilton, the innkeeper, who, pointing to the Carthage graves, said, "Hoge, there are the boys that will settle you Mormons." Hoge replied, "We can take as many as there are out of the Nauvoo Legion, and they would not be missed." End quote. Hoge wasn't wrong here. The Carthage Greys that Hamilton was pointing at here, that was just one small division of the state militia comprising about 150 to 200 men. You could easily remove 150 to 200 men from the Nauvoo Legion and not even realize they were missing. That's about 5% of the total Legion numbers. And as I talked about last episode, by any and every calculus, even with their state-provided arms seized, the Nauvoo Legion wins every armed encounter against any militia that Governor Ford could gather. And another detail worth noting here, Governor Ford officially disbanded the Nauvoo Legion in reaction to the martial law declaration in Nauvoo. But just because the governor says you're no longer an official militia, those men don't forget their training and then get rid of their guns and uniforms. It did mean, however, that if any contingency of the Legion mustered for any reason, they would be treated as a rebellious force and they would be dealt with accordingly. Ford was doing literally everything in his power to keep that from happening, to keep the Nauvoo Legion from gathering any number of men together with their arms. And this fact is noticed by the compilers of the church history. Quote, "It appears that Governor Ford feared that the Nauvoo Legion, although disbanded, might avenge any outrage that might hereafter be committed on the persons of their leaders, and so thought he had better disarm them as he had previously disbanded them." End quote. However, the compiler of the history of the church, George A. Smith, he didn't stop there. He provides his own commentary for Ford's motivations here, which I believe are drastically misplaced. Quote, "Yet the mob was suffered to retain their portion of the state arms, even when within a half-day's march of Nauvoo, and they in a threatening and hostile attitude, while the Nauvoo Legion had not evinced the least disposition whatever, except to defend their city in case it should be attacked, and they had not set a foot outside the limits of the city." End quote. Okay, so there are a few ways to look at George A. Smith's commentary of Governor Ford's motivations here, right? Governor Ford didn't disarm the Nauvoo Legion so that his militia could burn the city down unopposed, right? He did it to stop violence from breaking out in the first place. And if violence did break out, make it much easier to arrest that violence. But beyond that, it wasn't so much what the Legion had done that was feared by Governor Ford and the officers of the state militia. It was much more about what they were capable of. When Joe was arrested in Dixon, Illinois back in June 1843, that's just a year ago from our timeline, it was his Nauvoo Legion who rode out of the city of Nauvoo and rescued him by placing the officers who arrested Joseph Smith under the arrest of the Legion. Those men, Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds, barely escaped Nauvoo with their lives. What was to ensure that the Nauvoo Legion wouldn't act similarly as soon as this arresting posse had Joe in their custody again? Additionally, if Ford decided to disarm the state militia in addition to the Nauvoo Legion, that's an asinine request. The state militia lacked the organization and the centralized command and geography that the Legion had, meaning that the state militia would be at an incredible disadvantage if they were reduced to their own private arms when violence broke out. To summarize, let me tie those threads together. Look, the men in the Illinois Militia came from all over Adams and Hancock counties, cities that were multiple days' journey away from each other. So if any disorganization took place, the consequences were dire, and intelligence was traveling at the speed of a horse was always a hindrance. The Legion, however, they all lived in the same city, and all of their private arms were in people's houses just blocks away from each other. So if Ford decided to disarm everybody instead of just the Nauvoo Legion, the Mormons would make very short work of any unarmed militia attempting to enforce the laws or directives of the governor. Disbanding and disarming the Legion was clearly the most prudent course for Governor Ford, even if the Mormons collectively groaned under the order and suspected it was the beginning of a conspiracy to burn the city to ashes. So the order was carried out. All of the Nauvoo Legion's arms were consolidated at the Masonic Lodge and then put into the possession of Captain Dunn under the orders of Governor Ford. Now the posse could finally return to Carthage to comply with the original arrest warrant that was nearly 2 weeks old by this point. But of course, some more tearful goodbyes. This is the third set of tearful goodbyes were in order. Quote, Joseph rode down home twice to bid his family farewell. He appeared solemn and thoughtful and expressed himself to several individuals that he expected to be murder. This he expected before he returned from over the river. But there appeared no alternative but that he must either give himself up or the inhabitants of the city would be massacred by a lawless mob under the sanction of the governor. End quote. So Joe's not wrong. There was no alternative. But he is wrong in that if a militia is operating at the direction of the governor, it is by definition a lawful militia, not a lawless mob, as he states, right? I know that's a pointless quibble, but the Mormon persecution narrative is replete through every single page here, and I need to call that out for the lies which spawn it and nurse that persecution narrative to health as it stands in the Mormon community and culture today. Continuing, history of the church. Quote, the company, about 15, then started again for Carthage, and when opposite the Masonic Hall, Joseph said, boys, if I don't come back, take care of yourself. I am going like a lamb to the slaughter. Yet another iconic line in this part of Mormon history. When they passed his farm, he took a good look at it, and after they had passed it, he turned around several times to look again, at which some of the company made remarks when Joseph said, if some of you had got such a farm and knew you would not see it anymore, you would want to take a good look at it for the last time. End quote. Okay, we get it. Lamb to the slaughter, butchered, calm as the son of Mers Morn, right? He was setting himself up as a martyr, even though he was clearly unwilling to die and only forced into state custody when continuing to flaunt the law meant total war and a massacre of himself and his people. Continuing. When they got to the edge of the woods near Nauvoo, they met A.C. Hodge returning from Carthage. He reported to Hyrum what he had heard in Carthage, told him what his feelings were, and said, Brother Hyrum, you are now clear. And if it was my duty to counsel you, I would say, do not go another foot, for they say they will kill you if you go to Carthage. But as other persons gathered round, nothing further was said. End quote. So they received this intel from Hodge, and he'd obviously, in hindsight, he wasn't wrong, right? But the options were not go another step further and declare war against the state of Illinois, or go a step further and face the law, thus preserving the lives of 15 to 20,000 Mormons in and around Nauvoo. However, after A.C. Hodge told this to Hyrum, another messenger appeared with 2 letters for the prophet from Carthage. Quote, Dear Sir, In accordance with previous arrangement with Elder Adams, I am here at your service, and it will be necessary for us to have on the examination here before the justice a certified copy of the city ordinance for the destruction of the expositor press, or a copy which has been published by authority. We also wish the original order issued by you to the marshal for the destruction of said press, and such witnesses as may be necessary to show by whom the press was destroyed, and that the act was not done in a riotous or tumultuous manner. Respectfully yours, H.T. Reed. The second letter. Dear Sir, I concur fully as to the above, and will add, from an interview with Governor Ford, you can with the utmost safety rely on his protection, and that you will have as impartial an investigation as could be expected from those opposed to you. The excitement is much allayed, and your opponents, those who wish to make capital of you, do not want you to come to Carthage. Mr. Johnson has gone east, and that will account for Mr. Reed being here. Respectfully, your obedient servant, signed James W. Woods. End quote. So, these two letters were requests for documents and insurance from Governor Ford that Joseph would be safe. So, with these final assurances in place, the posse continued towards Carthage. Quote, the company arrived at Fellow's house, 4 miles west of Carthage, about 9 p.m., where they stopped about half an hour and partook of such refreshments as they had brought with them. Captain Dunn and his company of mounted militia, returning with the state arms from the Nauvoo Legion, joined them here and escorted them into Carthage, where they arrived at 5 minutes before 12 at night and went to Hamilton's Tavern. End quote. Finally, after defying the original arrest warrant for a few hours shy of 2 weeks now, and running from Governor Ford's enforcement of that arrest warrant for 40 hours now, and delaying another 12 hours beyond Ford's gracious extensions of that arrest warrant, Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, and their posse were in Carthage 5 minutes before midnight of June 25th. And understandably, they were greeted by all those who had been expecting them in the city for 40 hours by this point, with some derision and excitement. Quote, while passing the public square, many of the troops, especially the Carthage Greys, made use of the following expressions, which were re-echoed in the ears of the governor and hundreds of others. Where is the damned prophet? Stand away, you McDonald boys, and let us shoot the damned Mormons. God damn you, old Joe, we've got you now. Clear the way, and let us have a view of Joe Smith, the prophet of God. He has seen the last of Nauvoo. We'll use him up now and kill all the damned Mormons. The rear platoon of the Carthage Greys repeatedly threw their guns over their heads in a curve so that the bayonets struck the ground with the breech of their guns upwards, when they would run back and pick them up at the same time, whooping, yelling, hooting, and cursing like a pack of savages. End quote. Of course, the Carthaginians were rejoicing. They'd finally captured public enemy number 1, a fugitive from justice for over 4 years who'd been abusing their generosity and good natures for that same amount of time. But there's a much larger force at work here, and it's a sword that cuts both ways. Dehumanization. To the citizens of Carthage and the gathered militia camped in the city, Joseph Smith was a heaven-daring wretch, a demon in human form, a blasphemer, a knave, the most diabolical and black-hearted monster the world had seen since the reign of Napoleon. For the Mormons, these men cheering at the arrest of Joseph Smith were the adversary. They were the mindless mobocrats seeking to destroy the kingdom of God and oppose the Lord's righteous designs for building the promised land. These people were oppressing and persecuting the Mormons every step of the way, and they were motivated by the same spirit that left 18 Mormons dead, covered in bullet holes in a sawmill back in Missouri. This isn't just a bunch of drunken idiots in the 1840s. This is us. This is human, and this is how we treat our enemies. We can look at this behavior and discuss how irrational everybody here was acting, but who wouldn't act exactly the same way watching video of the president being removed from the White House in handcuffs, or the previous president being removed from the White House in handcuffs? It depends on where you fall on this asinine bipolar political spectrum that we become the victims of. It takes a cool head to act rationally amidst this much excitement and particularly drunken chaos between these warring tribes. The trouble is, the coolest head is often the quietest voice in the room. In this case, the coolest head was Governor Ford, and he was dealing with over 1,000 drunk men at midnight, seeing their sworn enemy ride into town with only a posse of 18 other men who were also guilty and equally their enemies. And these 18 men were incredibly vulnerable to vigilante justice. At no other point in Joe's entire life had he been so vulnerable than the night of June 24th, 1844, riding into Carthage 5 minutes to midnight. Governor Ford immediately tried to calm the emotions and to get people to withhold their celebratory lynching and just go to bed already. Quote, on hearing those expressions, the governor put his head out of the window and very fawningly said, "Gentlemen, I know your great anxiety to see Mr. Smith, which is natural enough, but it is quite too late tonight for you to have the opportunity. But I assure you, gentlemen, you shall have that privilege tomorrow morning, as I will cause him to pass before the troops upon the square. And I now wish you, with this assurance, quietly and peaceably to return to your quarters." When this declaration was made, there was a faint, "Hurrah for Tom Ford!" and they instantly obeyed his wish. End quote. For Governor Ford to be able to thwart a lynching that quickly amidst this much chaos and excitement is truly an expression of how universally respected the guy was. In many ways, Joseph Smith entering Carthage and surrendering to arrest, that was a massive victory for Governor Ford. He'd effectively brought a rebellious fugitive into state custody while avoiding what seemed at many points to be an inevitable civil war. The confusion of the past 2 days made his job exponentially harder, but he still kept his cool, and his ability with a few words to quiet a mob of 1,000 drunk men itching for murder and to send them all to bed is a remarkable display of power. What it reveals further is that Ford really had the rule of law and the interests of the state and its people in mind, and not the interests of the respective parties, right? He didn't take sides in this conflict. He merely acted as umpire, and the players agreed that his calls were the law. But this one small victory of one small battle, it just signaled that the war was still ahead for Governor Ford. And to make tensions even worse, Hamilton's hotel was bursting at the seams with people, and it was the only place in Carthage where people could sleep out of the harsh elements. Quote, there was a company of apostates also quartered at Hamilton's hotel. This is a rap sheet of the ultimate apostates and enemies to Joseph Smith. These are the people who were staying at Hamilton's hotel with the prophet after his surrender. William and Wilson Law, the Higbees and Fosters, Augustine Spencer, Henry O. Orton, John A. Hicks, formerly president of the Elders Quorum, and others. Hicks stated to Cyrus Wheelock that it was determined to shed the blood of Joseph Smith by not only himself, but by the Laws, Higbees, Fosters, Joseph H. Jackson, and many others, whether he was cleared by the law or not. He talked freely and unreservedly on that subject, as though he were discoursing upon the most common occurrence of his life. Said he, "You will find me a true prophet in this respect." Cyrus Wheelock told Governor Ford what Hicks had said, but he treated it with perfect indifference and suffered Hicks and his associates to run at large and mature their murderous plans. End quote. Of course, Governor Ford reacted with indifference to this intelligence, because he's been listening to hundreds of dudes talking about killing Joseph Smith nonstop for 3 days since he arrived in Carthage. In fact, everything he did was to keep those musings from becoming a reality. Now, Governor Ford couldn't stop people from conspiring against Joseph Smith. He could only thwart the plan once it was put into effect. He was a governor, not a god. Besides, Governor Ford was an elected official, and he had to balance his actions with the desires of his constituents while also not appearing a complete fool or partisan to his political opponents. Could he retain control of the situation with these enemy tribes quartering in the same city? Could the peace be maintained? From Governor Ford himself, quote, I observed that I was narrowly watched in all my proceedings by my Whig fellow citizens and was suspected of an intention to favor the Mormons. I felt that I did not possess the confidence of the men I commanded, and that they had been induced to withhold it by the promulgation of the most abominable falsehoods. I felt the necessity of possessing their confidence in order to give vigor to my action, and exerted myself in every way to obtain it, so that I could control the excited multitude who were under my command. I succeeded better for a time than could have been expected, but who can control the action of a mob without possessing their entire confidence? It is true also that some unprincipled Democrats all the time appeared to be very busy on the side of the Mormons, and this circumstance was well calculated to increase suspicion of everyone who had the name of Democrat. End quote. As much as this was a purely legal issue, politics couldn't be disentangled from the public fury and the personal motivations of the politicians and of saboteurs, and those forces can never be underestimated in public conflicts like this. Ford could only act within the confines that the situation in his office dictated, which was most often counter to what people wanted. The confusion caused by Joe agreeing to surrender and then reneging and then agreeing at a later time and then finally coming into Carthage on his own terms that obviously inflamed Ford's closest advisors during this conflict. And Ford reflects on the past 2 days with a sense of despair and exhaustion in History of Illinois. Now, these excerpts that I'm going to read from History of Illinois, this basically summarizes that everything that we've discussed in today's show and also last week's a little bit as well. Governor Ford, quote, upon the arrival of the constable and guard, the mayor and common council of Nauvoo at once signified their willingness to surrender and stated their readiness to proceed to Carthage next morning at 8 o'clock. Martial law had previously been abolished. The hour of 8 o'clock came, and the accused failed to make their appearance because they had crossed the Mississippi. They were in hiding, right, on William Jordan's farm with Willard Richards and Orrin Porter Rockwell. Joseph and Hyrum were hanging out on this farm, right? That's why they failed to make the appearance. The constable and his escort returned. The constable made no effort to arrest any of them, nor would he or the guard delay their departure 1 minute beyond the time to see whether an arrest could be made. Upon their return, they reported that they had been informed that the accused had fled and could not be found. End quote. So it's a good thing that arresting posse didn't stick around too long, because Joe wasn't coming into town until late that evening anyways. But he continues of describing the larger plan that was devised by the arresting posse here. Quote, I immediately proposed to a council of officers to march into Nauvoo with a small force then under my command, but the officers were of the opinion that it was too small, and many of them insisted upon a further call of the militia. Upon reflection, I was of opinion that the officers were right in the estimate of our force, and the project for immediate action was disbanded. I was soon informed, however, of the conduct of the constable and guard, and then I was perfectly satisfied that a most base fraud had been attempted. That, in fact, it was feared that the Mormons would submit, and thereby entitled themselves to the protection of the law. It was very apparent that many of the bustling, active spirits were afraid that there would be no occasion for calling out an overwhelming militia force for marching it into Nauvoo, for probable mutiny when there, and for the extermination of the Mormon race. It appeared that the constable and the escort were fully in the secret and acted their part to promote the conspiracy. End quote. It was all a plan. It was all a ruse. The constable never wanted Joe to come to Carthage with him that morning. He wanted Joe to refuse to be arrested and flee. And that would force Governor Ford to call the militia into Nauvoo. It was all just a ruse to give them an excuse to burn Nauvoo to the ground. The circle of people that Governor Ford thought that he could trust in this brewing conflict was growing smaller every day, and he acted the only way that he could by waiting to see Joe's next move, right? Quote, seeing this to be the state of the case, I delayed any further call of the militia to give the accused another opportunity to surrender. For indeed, I was most anxious to avoid a general call for the militia at this critical season of the year. After that, he goes on to discuss the historic flooding that was happening this spring and how it tied up any supply lines for a sizable militia. This great flood destroyed the last hope of getting provisions at home, and I was totally without funds belonging to the state with which to purchase at more distant markets, and there was a certainty that such purchases could not have been made on credit abroad. For these reasons, I was desirous of avoiding a war if it could be avoided. But then Governor Ford tells us about why he elected to seize the state arms of the Nauvoo Legion, which led to even more confusion and feelings of persecution on the part of the Mormons, especially because one of Ford's informants about how many arms the Mormons had was Wilson Law, one of the publishers of the Expositor and one of the 8 greatest public enemies of the prophet at the time, right? Quote, I made a requisition upon the officers of the Nauvoo Legion for the state arms in their possession. Of course, Captain Dunn was the guy who executed this with the help of Joseph Smith, right? It appears that there was no evidence in the Quartermaster General's office of the number and description of arms with which the Legion had been furnished. Dr. Bennett, after he had been appointed Quartermaster General, had joined the Mormons and had disposed of the public arms as he pleased without keeping or giving any account of them. On this subject, I applied to General Wilson Law for information. He had lately been the Major General of the Legion. He had seceded from the Mormon party, was one of the owners of the proscribed press, had left the city, as he said, in fear of his life, and was one of the party asking for justice against its constituted authorities. He was interested to exaggerate the number of arms rather than to place it at too low an estimate. From his information, I learned that the Legion had received 3 pieces of cannon and about 250 stand of arms and their accoutrements. Of these, the 3 pieces of cannon and 220 stand of small arms were surrendered. These arms were demanded because the Legion was illegally used in the destruction of the press and enforcing martial law in the city in open resistance to legal process. But there's more, because fake news had blown this number of 3 cannons and 250 stand of arms to epic proportions. Ford continues. I demanded the arms surrender also on account of the great prejudice and excitement which the possession of these arms by the Mormons had always kindled in the minds of the people. A large portion of the people, by pure misrepresentation, had been made to believe that the Legion had received of the state as many as 30 pieces of artillery and 5,000 or 6,000 stand of small arms, which in all probability would soon be wielded for the conquest of the country and for their subjection to Mormon domination. I was of the opinion that the removal of these arms would tend much to allay this excitement and prejudice, and in point of fact, although wearing a severe aspect, would be an act of real kindness to the Mormons themselves." End quote. So yeah, Governor Ford removed the state arms from the Nauvoo Legion for their own protection. We can never forget what fueled the Mormons and anti-Mormons alike in this conflict, the impending Mormon Revolution. As much as it motivated fealty for the Mormons, it motivated the anti-Mormons to oppose everything the Mormons did, no matter how benign that action may be. Joseph Smith was a revolutionary of religious supremacy. He didn't belong in America in the 1840s, and those around him who didn't see a Mormon theocracy as a good thing were hypersensitive to the gluttony of the Mormon Empire. The Mormons having 30 cannons and 6,000 guns supplied by the state of Illinois to kick off the Mormon Revolution. That was a terrifying prospect, even though the numbers were inflated by misrepresentation, by fake news, right? Thanks, Thomas Sharp, the Warsaw Signal. It was the concept that people feared, not the scale of the concept. At the end of the day, Joe's present situation was the result of his own tyrannical and revolutionary tendencies. His own actions caused his arrest and confinement in Carthage. The fury between the Mormons and anti-Mormons were a product of Joseph Smith and the controversy he inevitably caused by trying to fabricate a world that was impossible and choosing to live in that world regardless of what 1840s America actually was. It was up to the victims of his quest for conquest to clean up his messes. And the threats of the lives of 15 to 20,000 Mormons in Nauvoo were the result. From Ford, quote, "Occasionally threats came to my ears of destroying the city of Nauvoo and murdering or expelling the inhabitants. Besides this, if we had ever so much disposed to commit such an act of wickedness, we evidently had not the power to do it. I was well assured that the Mormons at short notice could muster as many as 2,000 or 3,000 well-armed men. We had not more than 1,700 with 3 pieces of cannon and about 1,200 stand of small arms. We had provisions for 2 days only, and would be compelled to disband at the end of that time. To think of beginning a war under such circumstances was a plain absurdity. If the Mormons had succeeded in repulsing our attack, as most likely would have been the case, the country must necessarily be given up to their ravages until a new force could be assembled and provisions made for its subsistence. Or, if we should have succeeded in driving them from their city, they would have been scattered, and, being justly incensed at our barbarity and suffering with privation and hunger, would have spread desolation all over the country, without any possibility on our part, with the force we then had, of preventing it. Again, they would have had the advantage of being able to subsist their force in the field by plundering their enemies." End quote. In all of this, it's clear to me that the one saving grace in all of this rising conflict was Governor Ford. If he didn't have his head on straight and devolved to the partisanship and tribalism that seemed to govern the actions of everybody around him, war was the result. There was no other option. The Mormons and anti-Mormons would have waged an all-out war, and who knows how American history would have been shaped from that time forward. Anybody else handling this situation would have made one false step somewhere, and the consequences would have been dire and war. Governor Ford's only real mistake in this conflict was not having a large enough force guarding Joe and Hyrum in Carthage on June 27th. Otherwise, he handled this conflict the way we hope any elected official would handle a crisis of this proportion. Look, Governor Ford could have handled this the way the Mormon propaganda portrayed him as handling it, right? He could have done what Governor Lilburn Boggs did in the Missouri Mormon War of 1838. He could have marched Joseph and Hyrum into the public square of Nauvoo, held a court-martial, and ruled them as treasonous while officers of a state-sanctioned militia. Their actions absolutely merited this iron-fisted response and an execution. He could have marched his militia straight into Nauvoo, set the city ablaze for a rebellion, signed an extermination order, and declared the Mormons enemies of the state, and they'd spend the rest of 1844 moving to the Great Basin, and then a couple of years later, Governor Ford would be reading by firelight in his study, and then a shotgun blast would rip through his window and kill him, just like almost happened with Governor Boggs. Ford could have handled this the way that military law and the Constitution required. He should have marshaled together thousands of militiamen from nearby states who would have been happy to help the Illinois militias in uprooting and terrorizing the Mormons. The laws dictated this was a perfectly reasonable response. It was perfectly in line with the laws of the time for Governor Ford to treat this rebellion as a military rebellion and quash the Mormon movement within the boundaries of the United States. It would have made him immensely popular in Illinois, and he would go on to run for re-election or to run for Senate, or maybe even aim for a presidential cabinet position. But he did none of those things because he wasn't a partisan hack, and he wasn't seeking personal glory or aggrandizement. Even though many of the people at the center of this controversy were only in it for those reasons. Society rarely looks back fondly on tyrants. Joseph Smith exhibited tendencies people in pluralistic and democratic society can't help but fear, or worse, loathe. He was the problem here, and anybody who views Joseph Smith with pity or as the victim in all of this only does so through motivated reasoning. And history is replete with examples of men just like him, rising to power, bucking trends, building empires, overthrowing governments, and casting populations into the throes of uncertainty and chaos, often meeting their demise in tragic and violent ways. A person can't pull all of the levers and push all of the boundaries in a society without expecting violent pushback. That's what Joe did, and the pushback he received was the due process of law that he deserved. Even still, millions of people today see this as persecution. Here's a fun exercise. If anybody ever says that what happened in Carthage was the result of religious persecution, ask them, should Joseph Smith be subject to kings, rulers, magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law like his articles of faith dictate? If the answer to that question is yes, then you have grounds to say that he should have been court-martialed in Nauvoo and executed by Governor Ford via firing squad for treason and inciting rebellion. If the answer to that question is no, well, then we have a much larger problem on our hands, because the implication there is that the law of God is superior to the law of the land, that there are circumstances where people should follow their God instead of their laws. As soon as that becomes acceptable, the devolution into Christian theocracy is nearly complete. All right, that'll do it for our main segment today. We do have some new patrons to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you'll bear me a brief moment to do this before we get into a couple of announcements, we have new pledge by Michael, a new pledge by Adam, and as well by Mary. So to our newest patrons over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, thank you so much for pledging to support the show with your hard-earned money, giving it to me so that you can fund the research that goes into this podcast. Also, speaking of Patreon, I made a mistake last week, and a few people reached out and let me know that I did this. I accidentally uploaded the patron episode to the regular feed, so I realized that after the fact, and just kind of shrugged, because, oh well. So if that's something that you enjoyed last week, consider, joining the ranks of our patrons in Nemo Outer Darkness, and you get extended editions of every new episode that has that variety show segment of just me blathering on aimlessly, pointlessly, and listlessly for however long I feel like doing, which is what's going to happen this week as well, and the next week, and the next week, and the next week. So with that, we do have a couple of announcements coming up here. I recently made an appearance on the How to Heretic podcast. A friend of mine, Uncle Mark, invited me on to come on and talk about the Strengthening Church Members Committee. Now, How to Heretic is a really fun podcast. They basically do a 101 of hereticism, heresy, whatever the case is, whatever. They do a really good job of just kind of informing those who oftentimes are new to a faith transition and want to learn how to navigate the world of non-religion, as well as understanding a little bit of comparative religions. They do various segments that are really fun. The co-hosting dynamic that they have, three of my friends, Uncle Mark, Uncle Doug, and Uncle Dan, it's very enjoyable, and it's a hilarious podcast to listen to. So Uncle Mark invited me on to talk about the history of secret societies within Mormonism, beginning with the Brother of Gideon Society and the Danites, and transitioning all the way into the modern era with the Strengthening Church Members Committee. It's a really fun episode. That's How to Heretic, episode 140. I have it on good authority that episode is going to be dropping about the same time that this episode drops. I'm going to do my best to provide a link to that episode specifically in the show notes for this week. So you can just scroll down and hit that, and you're right onto the right episode. If not, then I'll provide a link to the How to Heretic website, the podcast website there, and you can navigate to episode 140 where you can listen to that. Also, coming up, and this is a super important announcement, Sunstone is happening. Now, I know that we are kind of in a weird world here in early 2020, early to mid 2020, that we have these physical distancing orders in various states are shut down still due to COVID-19. And what Sunstone has decided to do is to do a completely virtual conference, the first ever virtual Sunstone. How they're conducting this is, instead of getting together at the University of Utah at the I believe it's called the Tanner Center that it used to be, or the Mountain America Expo Center where it's been held the last few years, they're just going to do it completely virtually. So what is Sunstone? Well, Sunstone is the premier gathering. It is the Mormon con that people go to. And it's been diversified in recent years to really include a much wider swath of different beliefs and different faith traditions within Mormonism, instead of just focusing so heavily on the Salt Lake City church. Sunstone is truly an incredible conference, and since I started going, I want to say 5 years ago, I haven't missed a single year of the big Sunstone. I've also been to a number of the smaller satellite Sunstones here in Seattle, as well as the one down in Short Creek. It's a really fun get-together. Check out sunstonemagazine.com for all of the details. You find a link to it in the show notes this week, as well as every upcoming week until it happens on July 29th through August 1st. It's an entire weekend affair. Normally, you gotta go to Salt Lake City. If you already live there, that's not a big deal. But if you're like me and you live in Seattle, you gotta travel to Salt Lake City for Sunstone. Well, this is the first time that it's being held virtually, and it's being held over the Whova app, which allows you to attend sessions and ask questions, as well as hold virtual hangouts with other attendees. All you got to do is check sunstonemagazine.com. You find all of the details about the 2020 symposium coming up July 29th through August 1st of 2020. I'm going to be presenting on the latest research of entheogens in early Mormonism, in Joseph Smith's Mormonism. And my co-presenter, Brian Kassenbrock, will also be presenting on the possible influences of entheogens within the text of the Book of Mormon itself. Entheogens, of course, psychedelics in early Mormonism. So that presentation is going to be happening. I don't know exactly what time slot we're going to have, but Sunstone always has just a fantastic roster of some of the best presentations and some of the most controversial research and presentations that have been given in the field of Mormon history have happened at Sunstone. It's truly a monumental symposium every year that they have, and this year it's all going to be virtual. Once again, sunstonemagazine.com, or check the show notes for a link to that to find all of the details that you need in order to go and attend virtually from your living room or your office, or from while you're walking around the neighborhood, or whatever the case is, in physical isolation, physical distance, away from having contact with everybody, and, you know, in a safe, social safety kind of way to attend a really fantastic symposium. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be attending a bunch of sessions. I'm going to be presenting. And if you want to hang out with me and do a virtual hangout, hey, send me a request on the Whova app. Let's hang out. Let's chat for a little while before, in between sessions or whatever. All right. That seems to be all of the announcements for this week. I think, yeah, we're all done. Yeah, that's it. Awesome. Well, listeners, hey, thank you all so much. You tuned in. You gave me your time. That's the most valuable resource that any of us have. So for that, I want to thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.